So, I wanted to kind of this year get back to some of the basics of our faith, right? Some of these founding stories, because we think we know them, but a lot of times we don't, because we didn't want to read them again after we learned them as children. Even today, when Jim was like, she's going to be talking about Noah, Elizabeth is like, why are you talking about Noah? I know Noah. Why don't they know Noah? I've heard it 1,000 times. I'm like, yes, but you have not heard what I'm telling them, first of all. And I don't know if they have either, but maybe. But it's always good to revisit. So who's familiar with Noah's Ark? Everybody? I'm not going to take that for granted. Some people aren't. So it's always good to kind of get on the same page. What comes to mind? I'm going to ask you all to kind of shout out a little bit as we go, just to kind of get to know each other's backgrounds and what we each learned, because it's pretty surprising the differences sometimes as to what we think about these stories. So, someone want to talk about what they think Noah's about?
The animals 2 by 2.
Animals 2 by 2. Yep.
Great flood.
Great flood. Anything else jump to mind?
Building of the ark.
40 days and 40 nights.
40 days, 40 nights, what was it?
Building of the ark.
Building of the ark, yep, okay. All classic moments. This is a story that's pretty common. Even if you didn't go to church, you may have seen it splashed on an archery wall somewhere with some animals peacefully going into a boat 2 by 2. You think of rainbows and doves as the sign of hope. But as an adult, when I go back and I look at these stories, I think that it's important to look at what type of literature we're dealing with. It's a popular story found in the book of Genesis, chapters 6 through 9. With stories like Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark, we often think that this is a mythical collection of tales. But what it actually is a book of law. Since it was originally a Hebrew text, I think it's important to look at it in that frame of mind, because that kind of helps us get back to the original meaning. Christian groups sometimes like to rebrand this as history, as myth, just disregard it as completely impossible, so don't think about it, it's a children's story. But if we start with the origin, we get closer to the meaning. So, Jewish scholars use these stories as allegory to show humanity's relationship with its creator. In particular, because it's a book of law, it's the idea of how justice or the law works between us and God. So when describing why many Jewish teachers don't teach the story as a pseudo-history, like we often do in modern Christianity, one rabbi that I was reading from said, "Why bother teaching something to children that they must then unlearn as adults?" I think this is an important lesson that we can apply in a lot of areas. I think we often try and teach our kids a lot of myth rather than actually teaching them meaning. So when evangelical groups or creationists put forth this idea that Noah is an accurate depiction of history, you get things like the Ark Museum that's down towards Cincinnati. Has anyone seen that? Yeah, a lot of people have heard it. It's basically like a theme park and zoo, like all mixed in one, where they try and show how the animals really were all on the ark and how it was possible and it's supposed to be what really would have been like. There are studies dedicated to proving that the boat of that size could have actually contained all of the world's animals. I remember in the 90s, I don't know if anyone else does, there was a TV special that claimed they had found the ark on Mount Ararat. It's this big deal. I was so excited. It's like an 8-year-old. So what do we think? Is it possible? Was there a flood? What are your opinions?
I think there's always been floods around river valleys, and all the civilizations grew up around rivers, great rivers.
Mhm.
And they've had their flooding issues and their lives lost and civilizations gone. So I think in that regard,
Yeah,
there's
floods exist.
Floods exist.
Well, we're seeing so many today.
Yeah,
With loss of life and loss of cities, not whole cities, but villages.
yeah,
I mean, from out of nowhere.
exactly, yeah, and it can seem just to kind of come and wipe it out. Do we think a great big flood really disrupted the whole world and that some guy built a boat and saved all of it, animals and recreated humanity?
No.
No? No judgment if you do. We're just trying to get to a starting place. It's good. There are people who think this.
Well, I can see why back, if this was a long time ago and everything, and their world was kind of small. And so if this flood, were big like we've been seeing, I can see where they might think that was.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. Like if it's a big flood, it could just be flooding your known world. It could devastate everything that you know of.
We're seeing it now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So there are hints of possibility. There are some rational facts that we can actually look into that point to some historical truths in this tale, which is actually kind of funny. There are flood stories around the world, and I've listed some in your packets. I'm not going to go through all of it because it's a lot, but there are ones from Egypt, from Iran, India, the Philippines, Taiwan. All of these have some similarities to the story of Noah, and there are more. So it's kind of funny that all of these cultures have a great flood story rather than just mini flood stories. I mean, yes, there are floods everywhere that there's a river or a lake or something that happens. Yep.
Is there any similarity to these areas? I mean, are we getting closer to areas that would be closer to the equator and things like that?
I don't know if that necessarily would play in it. The ones that I kind of chose, is mostly through Asia, bits of Africa and things. Africa also had, but it's not necessarily close to the equator.
Taiwan,
Right.
the Philippines, India.
Yeah, these are just some that I chose though. There are some throughout. But so there are a couple ways that we can think of this. Some of these are parts of cultural creation stories where their societies emerged. Some are more like Noah, where the society went bad and so God had to restart everything. And some come much later as more lore and myth. While you consider looking at your copy for a minute, this could be like their culture copying. Like maybe some cultures heard about this and so then they adopted it as their own. It became a part of their myth. So that's certainly a possibility as to why there are some similarities. There's also a possibility that the natural world flooded a little bit. And because it flooded, surely more than one culture would have documented that. But all the stories that are close and relate to Noah's Ark, the story of Gilgamesh is probably the closest that I've seen compared. Has anyone heard of the story of Gilgamesh before? What do you know about it?
It's one of the first recognized pieces of literature, written literature.
Yeah, it's one of the earliest forms. The Epic of Gilgamesh is similar to the flood story that was found in the mid-19th century in the Library of Nineveh, of all places. And we'll talk about Nineveh, and you may have heard it before with the story of Jonah. And that happens much later in history, but so that's an actual place. It's not just a Bible story place. This Gilgamesh was written in two languages. It was written in the Akkadian language and the Sumerian language. And Sumer is where the flood is most likely to have taken place. It's also worth noting that of the two cuneiform languages that were used, cuneiform is kind of like carved into tablets, it's like little dashes, kind of. They did find that it's actually related to an early form of Aramaic, which parts of the Genesis story was written in. And historians have also found evidence that these cultures did interact through trade, through wars. In the story of Jonah, we see that. So this could mean a few things. It could mean, like I said, that the story originated in the Sumerian culture and then was adapted into Hebrew literature. So that's a possibility. It could mean that since all of those cultures originate from a similar location, that they all have slightly different takes on the same event. So, the story of Gilgamesh is an epic poem. It's written on 12 tablets. I didn't write it out for you in summary because it's a lot to summarize, unlike some of the others that are a little shorter. As I said before, it was written in cuneiform, which is one of the earliest types of writing. It's about a deluge which overthrew the land, is kind of the summary. So the gods appoint one man who they find to be superior to the rest because of all the sin in the region. And the gods decide to flood the earth. A little familiar. So a lot of the basic points of the story are pretty similar, and I have a list there for you to kind of look at and compare. Both the Genesis story and the Gilgamesh story are considered to be a global flood, or at least within their known world at the time. The cause in both is man's wickedness in Genesis and man's sin in Gilgamesh. In Genesis, God speaks directly to Noah, but in Gilgamesh, the hero receives a message in a dream. We talked today about God speaking in dreams, so that's part of the course. So there are several instances of that. Both are ordered to build a boat. Both complain about having to build that boat. They both take only their families, really, or their households. And they both take all species of animals. Both experience heavy rain. Although in the Genesis version, we often don't talk about it, but it talks about the groundwater adding to it. So it wasn't just the 40 days of rains, it was also the grounds opened up with their water. And the length of time is different. In Genesis, we got the 40 days and 40 nights. We talked about that. In Gilgamesh, it's a more believable 6 days and nights. But they both released 3 birds to test the land. In Genesis, it was a raven and 2 doves. In Gilgamesh, it was a dove, a swallow, and a raven. So close. Although we do know that early fishermen and sailors would use birds to detect land, so that was a common thing. And both land on a mountain after the floods recede. Both make a sacrifice and then are blessed in some way. Noah gets the promise through the rainbow. Gilgamesh gets eternal life. So maybe a little. Yeah. So there are some differences. Comparison's obviously very simplified, but it's clear that they can be compared. So,
Are there dates for these writings?
There are, and I honestly forget what they are off the top of my head.
Because Gilgamesh predated Genesis.
Right, it's one of the earlier forms of writing, one of the earliest stories, so yeah.
So it's easily could be assumed that the writers of Genesis had the
Knew
document
of it.
of Gilgamesh and wanted to improve on it.
Yeah, exactly, it's very possible, and there have been other times when people have thought that the Bible copied or replicated from other areas. Again, that doesn't necessarily take away from the truth in it, but it is a possibility as to that's its origin. Because if you were going to have one great flood and everyone was going to come from one family, well, guess what? It's one family, so that story is going to pass down to different cultures that come off of that family, assuming that it's true. And the way that I always like to approach it is knowing that God is capable of anything, but looking at the facts that we can find and kind of meeting in the middle somehow. So I like to see if it could be true. knowing that if it's not, it doesn't shake my faith either. That this ultimately is not a history book. It is a law book. So then you have to look at what it's trying to tell you. And we'll get onto that in a minute. But it's fun to kind of look and see, well, where'd they get this to begin with? A lot of myths come from some sort of reality, even dragons. I mean, you've got early dinosaurs and fossils that people may have found where there are flying reptiles in the sky. You know, was it a dragon that breathed fire? Probably not, but it was a creature that had wings that they found and was scary. So history is based on reality in a lot of cases, or myth is based on history. All right, so let me see. Scholars have linked about how this myth came to, or looked at how this myth came to be. What they actually found was that a large flood was in the area of Mesopotamia. In fact, the people of Samaria, where the people of Samaria came from, it said flooding was so drastic, and there are actually scientific studies done on the rock formations and fossils where they can gauge that flooding happened. It was so drastic that they say that it increased about a meter a day. Scientists say that due to this, or that this was most likely due to the global warming at the time, which would have been towards the end of the Ice Age. So that's when this story, Gilgamesh, is said to have taken place. So there's a drastic rise in sea levels. Remember, we talked about how in Genesis they talk about it coming up as well as coming down. In the mythology of Nineveh, Samaria and Acadia, it tells about people walking out of the sea. And scientists say this could have been kind of due to the quick movement of peoples trying to escape the rising waters, that it would have been, they would have actually been walking out of the water towards Acadia. And Acadians have this creation story where they talk about fish man, half fish, half man, who come out of the sea and gives life to this new people. And so they kind of link it to this time of flooding, that all of these people would have moved and created this new society. Scholars say that Nineveh would have actually been really accepting of Jonah later on for this reason, because they had this early connection to this fish god. So why not send this man who comes out of this fish with this message from their creator? Of course they would have accepted it immediately. That's what they knew of. It's not a hard sell, which is really kind of amazing that that story happened so much later from the original. So now that we've compared these stories a little bit, talked about the archaeological evidence, and we can concede that a flood probably didn't happen in the whole world, but maybe the known world, what are some of your thoughts? What do you think?
I think they could have used it as an allegory based on some known facts. You know,
Yeah.
the flood happened, and the flood is a message from God that we need to repent.
Right. Yeah, there's flooding. That doesn't mean that it's exactly the way that it is. They don't claim that it's a history. It is allegory. It's just meant to be a lesson. Yeah.
And there are those who take that allegory or whatever as truth in current events. Now, I was just saying about the floods, but I don't remember that a couple of years ago or a few years ago, there was a big hurricane or something in New Orleans.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
I can't remember what it was called right now.
Hurricane Katrina.
Katrina.
Uh-huh.
And some fundamentalist churches believe that that was because of the sins of New Orleans, and that's why it happened.
Yeah, I remember them saying that. Yeah, that it was the sin that wiped us out.
That's in our day.
Yeah. So I know that normally we ended around 12, but because we got started so late, I hope you'll bear with me because this gets interesting. That's exactly kind of where I'm going with this. The story of Noah has changed a lot through the generations, and the focus has changed a bit as it's been told. Similar to basic fables, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Red Riding Hood. I know the story that I heard as a kid is a lot different than the original. One of the original versions rather, Little Red Riding Hood was a story about witchcraft and Satan worship and prostitution. All of those things are symbolized in her red cloak. That's why she wears red. And the wolf is Satan, who's going to eat her up if she strays from the path of goodness. That's the original story. Yeah.
I've never heard that.
Right. Well, there are some similarities to how Genesis has also been perceived. It gets pretty harsh to our fuzzy good kids stories that we tell later. And those were kids stories too, which is kind of crazy. For example, the more Puritan interpretation of Noah is that this is about the wrath and the vengeance of God on the wicked. What is that about? Then the lesson becomes more about the obedience of Noah. Noah trusted blindly with no real proof that the flood was coming, and he was, derided and made fun of by his peers. How would you do this? It doesn't even rain here. It's the story I heard as a kid. It's a pretty good lesson. You should trust in God, but that's not exactly what I think it's all about. I've seen this story interpreted as hard work being rewarded, laziness being punished, kind of like the little red hen story, where, the little red hen goes and does all the bread making and the wheat, whatever, and no one else gets to eat because she did it all. So Noah survives because he built the boat, and everyone else, lazy and wicked, gets wiped out. I've seen more recently the story used to teach children to love animals, that we should care for God's creation, because God sent Noah to care for the animals, so we should love them too. Good lesson, maybe not the main point. But it's interesting to know that when I first looked at this study in 2020, it was actually used at the Global Warming Summit with the United Nations in their documents and whatever, it's actually in there, that they talk about this as a reason that we should start caring again for God's planet. Because look what global warming did before. When the ice age changed, it flooded the world. Well, we should stop that. And we should really care and take care of God's world and the planet. True, again, probably not the reason it was written. Some people talk about Noah's Ark, about keeping promises or God's covenant. God makes the promise with Noah before when he starts to build the ark, and then solidifies that with the rainbow, which becomes known as the Noahic covenant. Any of these themes familiar? Yeah, so that's pretty much what we learned as children. So, now here's a bit of background about the story of Noah. So, we have God being angry. He's disappointed with all of these wicked people, and only Noah was good enough to be saved and his family, right? God tells him to build the ark, gather the animals, 40 days of rain and night. God made the sacrifice when he got to dry land, and of course, everything was brought to a happy conclusion with the rainbow. Still on the same page? Okay. Now, Noah is often thought of as one of God's biblical heroes. In kids' sections, he's lumped with them. Like they're actually hero vacation Bible schools that kind of like have him as one of them. It's a lot of times taught that he's sinless. So he was the reason he was chosen to restart the world, was because he was sinless. The Bible actually only says he was a good man, never says he was without sin. And although he's depicted many times in this way, the scripture doesn't say that the people laughed at him for building the boat.
Does it say what?
It didn't say that people laughed at him for building the boat. I remember a story of how Noah continued to trust even though the people treated him poorly, made fun of him. It's a desert region. It doesn't rain here. Why are you building a boat for a big giant flood? It's not going to happen. It's not in there. And this is a problem I have with a lot of these kids' Bible stories. We add a lot for the fun. We add a lot for these little kids' lessons, but we take out a lot of the truth. Another theory is that it mimics the creation story, only in reverse. Instead of starting with the waters being parted and the sea and the sky, and then giving humanity this task of caring for the animals, and then ending with sin, in the garden, we start instead with the sin of man. Go through the saving of the animals and end with the water coming back down from heaven and up from the earth, and then cleansing everything for this new beginning. And remember, this is a book of law, so we're telling stories about the relationship of justice and God. So it tells about the continued promise, our failure, our cleansing. So that kind of goes along with it, a lot, scholars think. And of all the theories I've kind of liked, there's another one that also compares it to the idea of baptism, kind of that idea of cleansing, which I'll talk a little bit more at the end. What I'd like to do is skip the whole main part of the story that I just sort of summarized and look around it a bit. There are a lot of problems morally with this story. I know some people can't get past it. It's blocked them from accepting their faith. A lot of people have used this as an argument against this idea of a loving God. How can a loving God let all these people die? That's not very loving. I've seen drawings where it tries to depict this chaos, where you see all the floating bodies outside of the ark. There was probably a lot of trauma associated with this that we don't talk about, of closing doors on everyone that you knew and watching them from the safety of your boat drown. That's a hard thing to think about. The trauma that there is in isolation, the idea of having to create this whole new culture from land that's been wiped out by flooding. Again, books oftentimes talk about, Noah comes out, it's a beautiful green land on this mountain, and there's this rainbow, and it's wonderful. Land that's been flooded is awful. It's muddy. It's got corpses. It's got debris. It's got all of this stuff, and that's what they would have come out onto. Not a great beginning. So the story would have encompassed all of this grief, all of this fear. And then at the end of the story, there's this other rainbow. After the rainbow, there's this whole other little bit that's left out about Noah. Nobody talks about this part because it's not really appropriate for kids. So the next part is the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah. From them came the people who were scattered over the earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard, and when he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside, but Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward, covered their father's nakedness, their faces turned the other way so that they would not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he found out that what his youngest son had done, and he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves, will be born to his brothers." He also said, "Bless the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be a slave to Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth, and may Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave." Bit darker. Probably not the part you heard as a kid. The good Noah is drunk. He's confused. This confused me a lot when I was a kid, because I did read it. And also, he's the one that did something wrong here, right? Why is he getting so angry at his sons that went and covered him up? So angry that he didn't just punish his son, he punished his grandsons, and his great-grandsons, and so forth. So what are your thoughts? Why is he so angry about this? What's the
I have
problem?
never heard that before.
You've never heard it?
And don't forget, I was raised Catholic, and we didn't do any of this until my recent years.
Yeah. Yeah, they leave it out. Obviously, it's real hard to kind of get through this with kids. Yeah.
Some creative writing to explain the civilizations that predated the writers of this?
A little bit. Yeah, that has a little bit to do with it. So, scholars have used the language in this passage and similar verses throughout the Bible to come up with an answer. So the thinking is that Ham, upon finding his father naked, raped him, and then told his brothers, who then came and covered him to cover the shame. Now, without understanding biblical innuendo, that might seem like a big leap. And kind of when I first heard that, I was like, seriously? Like they saw him and that you get that from that? But they use that type of language a lot to mean that. Similarly, sometimes to say to cover someone. Now, in this case, it's not true, but if you read the story of Ruth and Boaz, to cover someone means to sleep with them. But in this, so the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot also parallels Noah. They're meant to be related. It's also a destruction story and salvation. There are a lot of similarities, but within that story, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and after he flees and his wife turns to salt, his daughters make him drunk until he passes out, and they sleep with him in order to conceive and preserve their line. The difference here and the parallels is that Noah finds out and Lot doesn't. But that kind of proves a little bit more that that's probably what they meant, because the stories are so similar in that part, and it's more spelled out a little bit with Lot's. So in a world where it's pretty interpreted that homosexuality is bad, and that's not what I'm saying here, but that would have been thought at the time, and that incest is actually one of the worst sins of the time, and that rape, of course, also is bad, now we can understand Noah's anger a little bit more. It's not just that he got drunk and passed out and that his kids told about it or something. It's all of this added in. So Noah,
Aliyah,
yeah.
I missed something. What are we saying Noah was alleged of being?
We're saying that allegedly Noah got drunk and passed out.
Right.
His son Ham came and while he was passed out had sex with him.
I missed that part.
Yeah, so that he would have raped Noah.
Oh.
So he would have committed that sin, committed the sin of incest and the sin of homosexuality, if you consider that one. But culturally, they may have. So he would have Noah would have lost that entire line of his family because they brought shame and dishonor, and basically he no longer considers Ham a son. So not only does he not curse Ham, he gives him the worst punishment too. His son is now dishonored forever. And his son.
Generations.
Yeah. For this horrible, horrible, compounded sin. After God just cleans the whole world of sin. So he takes away all of Ham's hope of ever having a good future.
Can I put something in real quick?
Yep.
If you look at the chart with Ham, you're talking about Canaan. Well, what would be significant with that? What happens to Canaan when the Israelites leave Egypt? They settle in Canaan, and there are constant battles throughout the Old Testament with the Canaanites. So part of the story can also be seen as written to maybe justify some of the history that is going on between the cultures there. Everybody writes their own history to justify themselves, right? Whether individual or civilization. So you can kind of see that interaction going on in their version of events.
Yeah, exactly. So I was actually going to kind of anticipating it. It's all right. So Canaan's line goes on and becomes people who throughout the Bible are in constant battle with the Hebrew people, and this does justify there's so forth, the battles according to them.
The anger goes on and on and on. There's never any
Yeah.
resolving it.
Yeah. Now, this passage isn't often in children's versions of the story, as I've mentioned, but it does actually occasionally creep in to understand how sin is reintroduced into the world after God wiped out all of sin with the flood. So, let's take a look at a few ways the story has influenced part of our history. This passage was used for a basis of the temperance movement. It was Noah's drunkenness that introduced sin, ruined God's clean new world. So alcohol is the reason for sin and the reason not to drink. Lots of pamphlets on this. In researching this, I also found documents on the argument for American policy on slavery. Not just on general belief, but actual policy used to this, like as their justification. And I didn't think that would pop up when researching a kid's story, you know? It's not what comes to your mind at first. But it was said that Ham translated to the word burnt, and that was the curse of darkened skin that all happened. That when Noah cursed him, his skin darkened, and therefore he is the ancestor of all people of color come from him. Those people were wicked and they deserved perpetual punishment according to this.
Actually, it's still part of our policy. Nobody looks at it. But when you think about Western Samoa or American Samoa being a U.S. territory, it is the only American territory where the people there are not U.S. citizens. And it was written based off of this in the 1890s when we colonized it aggressively. They were using this excuse for that. It's still on the books. It's never been changed.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a little excerpt. I put a little illustration from there. I couldn't find a good one, but it is from the story of Noah, but it's from George Peltz's Grandpa's Stories, also called The Home Talks of the Wonderful Book. It's a book for children published in 1887. In this retelling, Noah Peltz tries to insinuate that there was no sin or misdoing on Noah's part. In fact, there's this long drawn-out talk where he says that Noah's creation of the wine was because he made too much grape juice. He made too much grape juice, couldn't drink it all, some fermented, and he did not realize what fermentation was because he'd never drank before. So he drank this grape juice, became drunk on accident. Noah is blameless. Purely accidental. Perhaps he should have joined the temperance movement because then he would have known all the evils of alcohol. That's what it says. Oh, this children's book. But he keeps going. He tries to nullify any misdeed of Noah that the story has so that there's no fault, and all the fault is on him. Though he doesn't go so far as to insinuate what I said about that current scholars talk about with the rape and all of that, he instead says that the act of an unworthy son who is dishonoring his father is the problem. In Peltz's book, the grandpa tells these stories. In the story, a question is asked, and he says, Noah was their father, and they, the second sets of sons, covered him. They honored him when he was drunk, Grandpa tells the grandchildren. Though Noah became drunk by accident, Ham's conduct was not an accident. He had made fun of his father. It was a base and unworthy act, and God is angry with every child who does not honor his father and mother. This is the story. I doubt any of you heard this version of as a child. I'm hoping. Through the story, it goes on to teach that children failing to honor your parents is enough to anger God. Judgment that it's on your children and their children's children, their children's children. So then Peltz goes on to write about the punishment. He says, the children asked, "In what way was Canaan cursed, Grandpa? What harm came to him?" asked Carrie. "From him descendants or descended those nations, the Africans, for instance, which have always been born servants of burden bearers of the world. That seems too bad, said both the girls together. But Ham was a mean, bad man, added Mary, to which Charlie added, very solemn, that's so. So Grandpa tells this story. Can you imagine? This is the children, just like one of these kids' Bible stories. You really got to be careful which ones you pick up. They're not all the same. And actually, I have some too that have some bizarre things that I read back from the 80s, and I'm like, what? That's not. Kids should not be reading that. That's not in there. I'm sure that I don't need to say this here because I know most of you, but it's worth noting scientists have done studies on DNA of known Canaanites. They didn't have skin any darker than anyone else from the area. Not that that should matter. It's also worth noting that Ham does not translate in any of those languages to the word burnt. Again, total myth. This type of reasoning into the problem of trying to make biblical characters into these perfect heroes and trying to force our ideals and identities onto a story is really dangerous, as we've seen by how it's influenced our own policy nationally. While it seems to make a nice, tidy way to justify slavery and prejudice, why does it matter that Noah was perfect? If not, it doesn't. Except for that white supremacy shows that the white Noah was perfect and the bad Ham was not. And so obviously he has to be from something other than that. And so that's why they darken the skin. The twisting of scripture, even in small ways, like thinking he was perfect. Such a small idea. This biblical hero worship, this flawless idea, it'll carry on kind of through some of my other stories too. We tend to do this, and I don't know why we do, because what it does is it makes people think they're not good enough to be Christian if they're not perfect. And if they become Christians, are we still good enough? I mean, how many times have you ever thought, well, shoot, I'm not good enough. I'm still not perfect. I thought that, I'd ask Jesus into my heart and it'd be great. When I was little, I remember I was 7 and I asked God into my heart for the very first time. And then I did it again. And then I did it again, over and over and over again, probably within the same week. And I finally told my mom. And she's like, you don't have to keep doing it every time. Just because you make a mistake doesn't mean that you have to start over as a Christian. God's constant with you. You're the one making a mistake, but that doesn't nullify that promise. So, this is my takeaway. The book is a book of law, teaching us about what? Is it teaching us about eternal punishment for sin? Or is it maybe going back to that idea of baptism? That idea that once a covenant and promise is made with God, like Noah's first promise made when he decided to build the boat, that even though he grumbled and complained, that even after he washed away the sin within his life or around him and made everything perfect, he still, got drunk. He still did all this. That God still sent the rainbow and then continues on through all the other stories. I think the story is a lot about this idea that God still keeps us, still keeps his promises, and does not destroy us, even though we sin. That's the idea of the justice. That even though we deserve to be wiped out with everyone else, when we accept God, we get that boat if we build it with him. And even after we've built this faith of ours, and we make stupid mistakes like poor theology that leads to some pretty devastating problems, even within the church, God still stays with us. We still have this covenant. We still have this promise. So I think that, and we'll see this more through a lot of the Old Testament stories, that though they seem really, really harsh and awful and devastating, it's really about God's interaction with us. About this, why doesn't God just dole out punishment and wrath when we keep failing? What is the law and how God deals with it? He deals with it like this. With the rainbow.
It's very raw, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think? Is it the Noah story that you remember? I encourage you to really all go back and read it because it's super twisted, some of it. When you try and compare it to, like, if you read this little book here, and I mean, I'll leave it out to flip through. My world has gone bad. I'm going to wash it in a flood. You know, it's super simplified. You don't get any of that. You miss the main point. If you're focused on how God saved this one great man who followed him blindly and trusted, all great concepts, kind of, we miss the main point, which is the grace. All right, it's late, and I'm sorry to have kept you, but thanks.
Thanks for being